Recently, we received news from the president that our economy had 0% inflation in the month of July. President Biden is misleading the American people on inflation. It is true that energy went down, but other important items went up, like food. Over the previous month, food was up 12% on an annualized basis for the month of July. Electricity was up 19.2% on an annualized basis in July. Just to name a few items that went up in July besides food and power, new cars and trucks, medical care, and shelter were all costing you more. Don't believe what Biden is saying to you about zero inflation. Look at your checkbook or your credit card statement. You must protect your family from the ravages of inflation. You need to find out if gold is right for you. Go to blackandwhites.us and on the homepage, click on the gold bar and get connected to our gold guru, Ira, at Advisors Metals. And ask Ira, is gold right for me? It's time for Black and White, a show that wants to bring all of us together, talking again about the issues that concern us. It's time to hear from people who only want to deal with facts. It's time for you to re-engage in your right of American free speech. It's time for Black and White. Welcome back to Blacks and White, and joining us today is a gentleman who could take the entire program just going over his biography and his accomplishments and, quite honestly, his failures, but his return. And I think Steve Beaman has really said in the first couple of lines of his biography, you were a self-made millionaire who sunk to the depths of depression as a result of financial upsets, but you rose back up to the heights of economic prosperity. And that's what America is about, the opportunity to succeed, to fail, and to succeed again. So congratulations on your success.
Well, I thank you. And I tell you, that is why I am to my death a believer in the American dream. It is uniquely American that can happen. I had meetings yesterday and I was telling a young fellow who's done very, very well for himself. And he's a humble guy, but we were talking about how you can have all the money you want, but it can go away with about 2 bad decisions. And you better learn to be content with yourself and not be focused on the quote love of money, but certainly work to enrich yourself as best you can, keeping in mind the bigger priorities of family and faith and health and those things.
I totally agree. And I'm concerned that we have a country that's rapidly slipping away from those basic fundamental values. But we're here to talk today, your perspective on the 2022 Inflation Act. Yeah. Which is, I just finished a commentary that was published. It is the quintessential example of the Democratic Party gaslighting the American people. What it says on the cover of the bill has nothing to do with what's inside the bill. So tell us your perspective on this new inflation bill.
Well, sometimes I can be kind of simple-minded, and I look at inflation as too much money chasing too few goods. That's typically what defines that phenomena. Right now, we have an economy in which the supply chain has been completely disrupted. And again, you could have a discussion about why that is, but it is disrupted nonetheless. And we have a society in which government is throwing more and more money at that more and more limited supply. When you throw that into not just the producer prices, but you throw it into energy supplies and things like that, gasoline, natural gas, it's a recipe for inflation. And the Inflation Reduction Act, in my opinion, having watched the economy for some 60 years now, is literally going to put more fuel on that fire. And I think that's why, as part of that bill, they hired 80,000 or 87,000 new IRS agents, is because it is going to hurt the economy and people are going to look for ways to save money. And the government's saying, no, you pay us first. We're your first priority.
Yeah. You know, it's when I first saw the early iterations of this, I was convinced that this was gaslighting on the part of the Biden administration. And we had a situation, even though the president signed the bill this past week, we had a situation where the consumer price index came out, and we had the president and the vice president, which I have now renamed them. I call them Dumb and Dumber. We're trying to convince the American people that we have no inflation.
Well, anybody who goes to a grocery store knows that's not true. And the inflation stated by the CPI has been proved time and time again in the academic halls of America to be wrong. It understates inflation by a little over 2%. So if it's at 8 point whatever percent, you can bet your bottom dollar that real inflation is more like 20%. And I think that's what you and I and Americans in general see at the grocery store.
Yeah, there in the commentary that I just wrote, just was published yesterday, I talked about the fact that while the president is saying that inflation was zero, we have no inflation, it was because of the downward spiral price of crude oil and in turn gasoline. However, what he didn't say is that the Commerce Department reported in that same report that food prices were up 12.5% annualized for the month of July.
Right.
That energy prices, meaning electricity, was up 19.2% in the month of July annualized. So there are many, many places where inflation is still there and growing. But we have the president and the vice president who are trying to convince the American people that it's all done. Inflation is over. And
they're not going to be able to do it. You know it and I know it. If you go to the grocery store and buy a dozen eggs that used to be 90 cents or 69, depending where you live, and it's now $3, you know, we talk about electric rate increases. Well, let's look at what fuels electric production in this country. For the most part, it's natural gas. Natural gas has gone from roughly $3 a metric, I don't know if it's a ton or however they measure it, up to $9, a 300% increase in natural gas prices. That is hitting the American consumer right in their electric bills. And again, all of this is contributing to what is becoming a highly recessionary, highly malaise-based economy. People, you know, they're making the same amount of money as they made 6 months ago. It just doesn't go as far.
Right. And even with the gas prices coming down to where they are, they're still considerably higher than they were when he took office.
And you and I both understand this pretty well, but it was 3-4 months ago, I was on a radio program and I said, as we come down to the fall, you're going to see declining gas prices. It has nothing to do with a balance of supply and demand. It has to do with a reduction in demand. And that's being partly caused by people saying, I can't afford to drive. So it's not caused by more production. It's not caused by a better supply chain. It's caused because people are simply saying, I can't afford to do it. We just saw today housing sales are way down. Is that a surprise? When interest rates go up, housing sales go down. So I think we, the American people, and I think that's Republican, Democrat, or anywhere else, I think generally people understand that we are hot and heavy in inflation. It's slowing the economy down, and it's a little bit scary for most people right now.
Yeah, I think one of the things that again is gaslighting on the part of Dumb and Dumber with this bill. You can use that if you want to, Dumb and Dumber. That's fine with me. Is that they talk about the amount of money that we're going to spend in this bill, $730 billion. As we heard yesterday, but after he signed it, the largest expenditure for Green New Deal in the history of a country, almost $383 billion.
Forgive me for interrupting, but it reminds me of this really successful enterprise called Solyndra.
Yeah. And how they burned up $500 million worth of taxpayers' dollars and went bankrupt. And moved the manufacturing to China and still went bankrupt.
This was not about Green Deal stuff. You're not going to produce any more solar panels because of this. You're not going to create new technologies. What this was a gift to the unions, because what they've said in the bill is we'll have grants and monies available for green projects. But in order to get that money, you have to be a union shop.
You know, it's amazing to me how the politicians, and I don't separate the Democrats from the Republicans in the games that they're playing, how they can stand there. I mean, I watched Manchin yesterday after the president signed the bill, and he was being interviewed by a reporter, and she asked the question, well, what I don't understand, Senator, is where is the inflation reduction in this bill? And he basically said, Well, there isn't any.
Well, we have to understand Joe Manchin signed onto this bill because they agreed to do a new pipeline through his state. So this was purely pay for play. They bought his vote. And again, that's part of the problem in the country right now is the politicians at the state level. Go look at Congress's approval ratings. On a national level, I think it's 17%, somewhere in that range. On a state level, at the district itself, it's 55 or 57%, meaning that we like our crook. We just don't like yours. Mm-hmm. And what Joe Manchin did was exactly like that. He said, I'm going to sign a bill that is demonstrably bad for small business, demonstrably bad for the economy as a whole, but you're going to give me some perks for my state. So he'll get reelected because he benefited his state, but it sold out the rest of us.
Right. And Christian Sinema, who was not going to support the bill because of the carry interest trade.
Right.
They pulled that out to get her vote. But what they put in a matter of minutes, was a, quote, a tax on corporations who buy back the shares of stock.
Right. Which isn't going to do anything. That's not going to affect, they don't understand how business works. Number one, that's not going to hurt the companies. If anything, it'll hurt the shareholders. And you say, well, those are just rich shareholders. No, those are 401k holders. They're IRA holders. They're America who owns a broad basket of these stocks in their own personal investments. So that's not going to hurt anybody but the average investor.
I totally agree with you. I look at it, we got about 2 minutes in this segment. I look at it from a slightly different perspective. The historic responsibility of the board of directors of a public company is to represent the interest of the shareholders.
Correct.
And the corporations, if they're lucky and have been successful, they have money in their treasury and they have a fiduciary responsibility to invest that money wisely, specifically for the benefit of the shareholders. And sometimes corporations will say that it's more appropriate to us to invest in our company by buying back shares than it is to take the risk of something else, at least for now. But what was really happening is that the money that was in the treasury was ultimately shareholders' money.
Right.
So they're giving the money back to the shareholders, trying to enhance the value of the stock. And now they want to tax that return of capital to the shareholders.
Correct.
Thinking that they're taxing the corporation, but they're really taxing the shareholders. It's crazy.
I've talked about this for 10 years on radio and public media. Corporations do not pay tax. People pay tax. So if you raise corporate tax rates, it's employees and customers who pay the tax. When you raise a tax like this, it's shareholders and customers who pay the tax. So this isn't going to help anybody. It's a boondoggle of a bill. It's just more of the same.
So what do you think the reaction is going to be? We got about 30 seconds here. What do you think the reaction is going to be by the American voter when they begin to understand that there's no inflation protection in this bill at all?
I think first, most people already know it. I think that's why you have a 70% of the American people think we're on the wrong track. I think people see through this. I don't think they're stupid. I think they clearly see what's going on. And I think when they go to the grocery store and they see these kind of prices, they know exactly what's happening, which is why corporate America, and I go to Jamie Dimon at Chase, he's coming out saying we're headed toward, in his words, a hurricane. Now, he doesn't know if it's a category 1 or a category 5, but that's a real fear. And I think people feel it and they know it, and that's how they're going to vote.
We are having an interesting conversation here with Steve Beaman. How can people follow you? Do you have a public website?
We're available at elevareclub.com. That's ELEVARE club.com. We're a club for small business.
We'll be right back.
This is Dan Perkins, your host for Black and White, and I'm also an investment advisor with over 50 years of experience in investing. Inflation is at a near 50-year high and perhaps going higher. The capital markets for the first 6 months of 2022 was the worst performing in almost 50 years. 2 generations and perhaps more have never experienced this level of inflation. You may have had some significant declines in your portfolio of investments in the first 6 months and are asking, what does the future hold? And by the way, what should I be doing now? I have grave concerns that we have not seen the peak in inflation. And because it may be around for some time, I want to introduce you to the Black and White Gold Ownership Program, run by Ira and his team at Advisor Metals. So go to blacksandwhites.us and click on the gold bar to take you directly to Ira to work with him to see if gold is right for you and your portfolio in protecting your investments. This is Dan Perkins. Thanks for listening. Welcome back. And we're having an interesting conversation about what's going on with the new inflation bill with Steve Beaman. And I want to ask you, Steve, this bill provides for the employment of 87,000 new IRS agents. Now, the current population of agents in the IRS is around 72,000. And here's an interesting statistic, at least to me. If they get all 87,000 hired along with the 72, they will have a standing army greater than 100 nations around the world. 100 nations around the world.
I actually think it's the biggest department of the U.S. government once that happens.
Could be. I did hear also today that the United States government is the largest employer in the world.
Oh, and has been for quite some time.
And I just, you know, I have real concern about this 87,000 armed IRS agents. And the rhetoric before the bill was that people under $400,000 won't pay any more taxes, and the agents are not there. And now after the bill signed, when they're talking about, well, maybe that's not quite true. Maybe they're going to try and get $20 billion of additional tax revenue from people who make less than 400,000.
Yeah.
You know, it's becoming so blatant that they're lying to us. Why do you think we don't care, or do we?
I think the American population has been lulled to sleep by our own success. I think we're on the top of the mountain and we're happy. And I think it is a recent event that Americans have by and large said, I don't think we trust this government at the core. Again, you can love or hate Donald Trump, doesn't matter. But when you watch how that's been handled, and we know the whole Russia thing was a hoax, it was made up. And I think that affects people. So when they look at this, they say, you don't want me to own guns, but you're going to put 87,000 armed agents after me. And whether it's true or not, the image of that and the narrative of that is scaring people. The small business sector, especially. You look at people who sell stuff on Facebook and the marketplace. And so they maybe have a motorcycle they sell for $1,000. The IRS is going to come to them and say, that's income to you unless you can prove that you paid more than $1,000 for that motorcycle. Well, how many people keep receipts? I mean, that's a fact. When you look at American small business who's scrambling to survive, they're not always the best record keepers, right? They don't cheat, but they're not the best record keepers. And that is going to be where these agents go. And I think that's just tragic. I think it scares the American dream. And as I said to you earlier, I believe so strongly in the American dream and its nature of you can start with nothing and build to something. And we are just squashing that dream. You look right, and forgive me for going on, and I hope you don't mind, but I've talked about how the rich get richer. And I'm not a believer in generally class warfare, but when I was in finance on Wall Street in the 1990s, we had 6,500, give or take, public companies. Today, there are something like 3,000. In other words, we've cut public companies by half or more. The reason is we've regulated it so much, companies don't want to go public. So in response to that, what's happened? Companies like an Apple computer, where we all could participate in that growth, those companies today, instead of going public, are bought by private equity. Well, the problem is the average mom and pop can't invest in private equity because you have to be an accredited investor. So they're missing the opportunities of our new digital economy because they can't invest in those companies. And we're forcing more and more money into the very top. Again, I'm not a class warfare person, but I see that and I say that is not good. That's not healthy. And all of these things are causing Americans to say, I know full well the system is rigged. Whether you're rich, poor, Republican, Democrat, I think everybody's starting to see the same thing, and they feel it, again, like we talked earlier, when they go to the grocery store or the gas pump.
You know, I totally agree with you. I look at what's going on and I wonder, do we have the courage as a country to, as somebody once said, throw the bums out? I don't know that we do.
I don't either. I hope that when it comes to voting, people will look beyond party affiliation and look to policy so that we can get policies. I hope that we get politicians strong enough to say, you can call it a swamp, you can call it whatever you want, but cut back the federal government. The federal government has gotten so big and so onerous that it's materially affecting the economy in which we live. And you can't have that.
One of the things, Steve, that doesn't get a lot of conversation because the Democrats don't want to talk about it, is the number of small businesses that were destroyed because of the restrictions around the pandemic.
Yeah, that's horrid.
Never to come back. Never to come back.
Again, the Elevator Club, which I chair, is a small business company. We work only with small businesses. And we watched many, many companies go out of business because they were shut down. Funny, Walmart didn't get shut down. Target didn't get shut down. The government didn't shut their wages down. You shut down the wages of small business America, whether it's restaurants, dry cleaners, whatever that might be. And to me, I understand it was a national pandemic. We had to try something, but we had the 15 days to flatten the curve. Those of us in small business said, okay, we'll do our part. When it came to a year of that and not even opening up then, American small business by and large is saying, you can't do this to us. You can't. But again, what's their response? We have to vote for people who have policies consistent with the American dream.
And whether you saw the head of the CDC yesterday announce that there was a major reorganization of the CDC because we basically got it wrong.
Well, and think about, again, the credibility of the government. Not only did you have the hoax of the Russia thing, which again, Republicans clearly saw it. The independents kind of said, wait a minute, what's going on here? But then you have the whole dishonesty of the Fauci-led effort on COVID. And people will say, well, you just don't like him. It's not true. What they called it the noble lie when they said masks don't help because we didn't have enough masks. Then they came out and said, well, masks really help. But science went against that and said, man, not really. But it just, the whole thing was a boondoggle. It was poorly handled. The only thing that really worked was Operation Light Speed. I mean, and that actually did work. But whether or not people wanted that vaccine or not became, again, a government saying you're imposing this on people when people by and large are like, I'm all for medicine. I had vaccines as a kid, but what if I don't want this? And you're forced now to do it.
We have in that vaccine area, when they brought out the vaccine for children under 5.
Unbelievable.
The rejection by parents shocked the CDC.
What you're going to have, this as well as I do, the schools will require it. If you want your child to go to school, they'll be forced to be vaccinated.
And that's going to wind up in the courts.
It will, because this is clearly unconstitutional, but it ties into, and again, we're going into a different topic, but the craziness of where we live right now. Wisconsin, they passed a rule in their school board or within the union that they're blatantly looking at race for hiring, firing, and rehiring. It's as unconstitutional as it gets, but we're putting those kinds of policies in. And again, when you take all that and translate it through the world you and I live in, into the economy, into small business, into job growth, into happiness and prosperity, which is what our country's about, it's beginning to whittle away at all of it.
Do you think that there will be any challenges in the courts to the new inflation legislation?
I don't know that there's a lot of constitutional question about it. Congress has the right to impose these rules. They have the right to raise taxes. They have right to enforce taxes. I'm not sure on what grounds it would be challenged, but I'm not a lawyer. And I'm sure there are creative constitutional lawyers out there who can find problems with it. But I look at it generally speaking and say, we're going to have to live under this until another Congress comes in and rescinds it.
So speaking of that, what do you think the outcome is going to be of the midterm?
I think, like most people, I would expect the Republicans to recapture the House. It's been interesting to watch in the primaries, the most obvious one, Liz Cheney's primary. But I think there's a chance that the Republicans will capture the Senate. I think that chance grows every day that people's lives get more and more difficult. And I can only hope that the people we put in actually care and actually say, we're going to vote to shut down this new legislation. We're going to cut the IRS back to what it was. Some of the money for the IRS, I actually support. They are living on 1970s technology. I'd like to see that upgraded. I think we could put tax collection into the blockchain and make it a lot less bureaucratic, a lot cleaner, and a lot less corruptible. So I'd like to see some modernization. We all have to pay taxes. I'm not opposed to that. I'm opposed to how it's done and why it's done and all the other things. But I think the American people are going to speak. I just hope the legislatures we elect actually do something.
I saw a very interesting commentary last night on the rejection of Cheney.
Yeah.
And the person who was making the commentary was saying that she believed that the defeat of Cheney was the end of her father's Republican Party. The Republican Party of today is new, fresh, dealing really with inclusive and bringing in Blacks and Hispanics and Latinos and Asians and everybody, and middle-class people. And
we're very populist at our core.
Right. And that's the new direction of what the Democratic Party is facing when they're running against the Republicans. Right. Is that the Republicans have taken away the Democrats' base, and it's going to, and that perhaps, she said, I thought was interesting, perhaps the debacle in November will be much greater than most people anticipate it's going to be.
I think it well could be. But, you go back to old line Republicanism and Democratic principles. If you look at the Democratic Party of the 60s and even the 70s, this Democratic Party looks nothing like that. Right. And I would argue the Republican Party looks nothing like it did under Reagan. I think both sides have gotten a love of big government, and bigger is better, and government can solve all your problems. The problem is, as you well know, they didn't learn from history. Government did not solve the problems in the Soviet Union. It's not solving the problems in communist China. And government cannot solve these. We, the people, have to solve our own problems.
I totally agree. I think that we're fighting against people who believe that we have all the money we need because we can just print it. And that they believe, while other people consistently have failed with their socialist or communist agendas, they're smarter than them, and they know how to make it work. And
they just didn't do it right.
Right. Well, unfortunately, we're out of time, sir. Thank you so much for joining us today. Where can people follow you again?
Again, it's elevareclub.com, and I am greatly appreciative of the time. We work together to save the American dream and fight for it everywhere we can and change people's minds and hearts to come along for this. Let's keep this dream alive for the next generation.
Thank you for joining us today.
Thank you.
We'll be right back.
The federal government just reported that the rate of inflation for the last 12 months was 8.5%, close to a 40-year high. This is Dan Perkins with Blacks and Whites. Prices continue to rise on other commodities besides oil. I ask you, what are you going to do to protect your money and your investment? It's time for you to take a serious look at gold for your portfolio. If you've had enough empty promises and misleading statements by the Biden government, isn't it time for you to take control of your money and your future? Go to blacksandwhites.us, and on the home page, click the bar of gold to be taken directly to IRA and Advisors Metals to ask the question, is gold right for me? This is Dan Perkins.